this broadcasting live our Zoom onto Facebook. Thank you all for joining us tonight. My name is Sean Wilson. I am the statewide organizer for the American Civil Liberties Unions of Wisconsin's Campaign for Smart Justice. Right now, Wisconsin's overcrowded prisons are a ticking time bomb that threatens the health of all Wisconsinites, especially people of color who are disproportionately impacted by mass incarceration. Wisconsin has one of the worst incarceration rates of Black men in the nation. The per capita imprisonment rate of Black adults is nearly 12 times higher than that of white adults. Although they made up just 6% of the state's adult population, Black people make up 41% of the prison population in Wisconsin. In the pandemic context, this is particularly troubling, as we see that African Americans made up half of the COVID cases in Milwaukee and about 80% of the deaths. The impact of the pandemic has pulled back the covers to clearly demonstrate our country's racial inequities, among many other issues. America's refusal to deal with its history of racism makes the impact of COVID-19 on Black and brown communities neither surprising nor accidental. It is the result of biased structures in housing, education, employment, healthcare, policing, and other sectors. Public health experts are warning that an outbreak in Wisconsin's overcrowded prisons will strain our hospital system, endanger public health, and claim thousands of lives. State officials have the power to avert this catastrophe, and they have to act now. We're suing to avert a public health catastrophe that will disproportionately impact communities of color and endanger the health of everyone in Wisconsin. So with that, I'm going to invite our legal director, Larry Dupuy, to talk more about what we've seen around the nation that has caused us to bring this lawsuit. Larry?
Thanks, Sean. So as you pointed out, this is a catastrophe on the horizon here in Wisconsin. And we've been hearing from people in the jail and prison system, both people who are clients of ours from prior cases, but also just we're hearing it more generally, that people are afraid, and there's good reason to be afraid. This is a very real threat. And what we've seen nationally is that as with other congregate settings, this virus is much more likely to be transmitted and just multiply rapidly in a congregate setting like a prison or a jail. So in a short 2-week period or so, the Cook County Jail went from having 2 cases, 2 positive tests, to now nearly 400 positive tests. And people have died in prison and jail settings around the country. The rate of transmission at Rikers Island, another very large jail in New York City, was estimated to be 7 times the rate of transmission in the general population. So the transmission rate is great. And then also, as we know, people in prisons are particularly vulnerable. There are older people with health conditions that make them more vulnerable to the virus. And so the concern is that this is going to explode in Wisconsin the way it has elsewhere. And there have been a number of cases that have been brought in other states, in other jurisdictions, attempting to ask the courts to do their part to help bring the populations in these prisons down. As we know, prisons are grossly overcrowded in Wisconsin. That's actually true around the country, and it's so obvious that our governor has, in fact, made it made a campaign pledge to reduce the prison population here by 50%. And now that is not just a hope, that's a need. And we've seen courts, state high courts, as we've done here. We went to the state high court. State high courts have stepped in, and federal district courts and district court judges lower court judges around the country have stepped in, some more aggressively than others. We're hopeful that the state Supreme Court here and this lawsuit and the information that was shared with it will help the folks in the current administration, the governor, the head of the Department of Corrections, and the head of the Parole Commission take the steps that are needed to really reduce the population, to make it at least give us some hope of doing the one thing that seems to actually reduce transmission, and that is make social distancing possible. Thanks, Sean.
Thank you, Larry. Now I'd like to invite Tim Moot, the ACLU staff attorney, to talk more about our lawsuit and what we hope to accomplish in Wisconsin. Tim?
Tim, you're still on mute.
Unmute. There we go. Most of you watching know that the ACLU of Wisconsin has been committed in our smart justice work, incarcerating this state dramatically and reducing the number of people behind bars. And that's incredibly important work for people's lives, for their freedom, for racial justice in the state. But as COVID-19 began to spread in the United States, began to spread in Wisconsin, this work became a matter of life or death. And so we began lobbying as the ACLU of Wisconsin. We began urging the governor, we began urging Secretary Carr, the Department of Corrections, prosecutors, others. And I know that many of you who are watching this got involved as well, sending letters, making calls, urging that people be released from jails and prisons, because we knew what would happen if the virus got inside of jails and prisons. And we've seen some progress at the county level. Milwaukee County Jail has seen a reduction in population. The Eau Claire Jail has seen some population. But at the state prison level, there has been very little happening, very little reduction in the number of people in our overcrowded prison system. And while time went on, people started to get sick in our prisons and jails. First it was guards, now it is inmates who have, at 5 at the most recent count in the state prison system, inmates in the House of Corrections in Milwaukee and the Dane County Jail. And still nothing happened, nothing meaningful happened at the state prison level. And finally, we didn't have any choice at all. We had to take action. Lobbying, letter writing, phone calls hadn't been enough. And so even though some are going to say that it's a long shot with this Wisconsin Supreme Court, we had to try. So this morning, we filed a petition with the Wisconsin Supreme Court, naming as respondents Governor Evers, Secretary Carr of the Department of Corrections, and John Tate, the chairman of the Parole Board. We have 2 individual inmates, prisoners as plaintiffs in the lawsuit, who stand as representative examples of the danger faced by everyone in the system. And we also have as petitioners the Wisconsin Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers and Disability Rights Wisconsin, advocating on behalf of people in our incarceration system. And our petition is called an emergency petition because that's what we are facing. And because it is an emergency, we skipped over the lower courts and we went right to the Wisconsin Supreme Court. Our petition says essentially that the state and the federal constitutions require, under the prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment, that you protect the people who are in custody, that you protect them, for example, from infectious diseases. For example, there are courts around the country that have said, you can't take somebody with active infectious tuberculosis and house them in the same cell as somebody else. That violates the right against cruel and unusual punishment. So the question is, what is needed to protect people in our jails and prisons from COVID-19? And we've all been told the answer to that question for the last several weeks. We know what the answer is. It's social distancing. I need to stay 6 feet away from you. I can't be breathing the air when you cough, the air when you sneeze. So we're asking the Wisconsin Supreme Court to rule that the Constitution requires the state to do much more than it currently is. We're asking for a special master to be assigned who will oversee a reduction in the population of the prison system in the state of Wisconsin. Because only with a dramatic reduction will you be able to get social distancing that the public health experts, the epidemiologists, the infectious disease specialists tell us is necessary. In doing that, the priority should be on older prisoners. It should be on those with pre-existing medical conditions that put them at risk. Then on those who have short terms left, those people, for example, who are already on work release going out into the community. But the goal has to be to reduce the population level in our incarceration system to such a level that people are not sleeping in double cells where one can infect the other. There has to be social distancing. And let us be frank, that involves thousands of prisoners. But there are more than 1,400 prisoners right now in Wisconsin prisons who are over 60 years old. And there are hundreds who are over 70 years old, if you can believe that, in our prisons in the state of Wisconsin. There are more than 4,800 prisoners who are 50 years old or older. Now, Secretary Carr said in an interview a year ago today that the Wisconsin prison system has contingency plans if there are an outbreak in a given correctional facility. But he also said that none of those contingency plans involving moving anyone outside of the secure perimeters of the correctional facility. Their plans do not include removing prisoners out of harm's way. Their plans do not include having overall reductions in prison population. Now, if you've been listening to Governor Evers and Secretary Carr, you may have heard them say, they've been saying it in emails in response to those of you who have emailed them, that they don't have any power to do any more than they are doing. And one of the goals of this lawsuit is to make it clear that, in fact, they do have more power than that. In particular, Secretary Carr has a power under state statute to declare that there is an emergency in the prisons. And we know that there is an emergency. That is clear, that is obvious. And when there is an emergency, the secretary has the power to prisoners in order to deal with the emergency. He has not done that. He has not taken that step, but he has that power. The governor has powers as well, particularly the power of reprieve. Plus, there are people who ought to be released early at the end of their sentence or put on supervised relief. There are a number of things that the governor and the secretary of the Department of Corrections, the parole board, can do to reduce the population dramatically. And that's a key message that we want you to hear tonight, that there's a power and it must be used. People are getting sick. Soon many more could be sick if the state does not act. After we filed the petition this morning, the Supreme Court gave Governor Evers and Secretary Carr, Chairman Tate, 1 week to reply to the petition. So we'll know their position on this lawsuit a week from now, and we will keep everybody posted on developments in the case. Back to you, Sean.
Thank you, Tim. Now I'd like to invite Emma Shakeshaft, our staff attorney, ACLU of Wisconsin staff attorney, to talk about some of the plaintiffs in the lawsuit. Emma?
Hi, thanks, Sean, and hi, everyone. Thanks for joining this evening. I just want to talk a little bit about the petitioners in our case, and then, next steps that everyone should be taking. So we have 4 petitioners in this case. The first is the Wisconsin Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, which is a membership organization of attorneys who provide legal representation for those who may be incarcerated. The second is another organization, the Disability Rights of Wisconsin, a nonprofit that protects the rights of persons with developmental disabilities or mental illness. And then we also have 2 petitioners who are currently incarcerated. Mr. Sussick is currently at the John C. Burke Correctional Center in Waupun and has been diagnosed with kidney disease, which makes him particularly susceptible to serious injury or death if he contracts COVID-19. He has been working in the community for some time now and has an incredible family support network. Our other petitioner is Mr. Ninneman, and he's currently incarcerated at the Winnebago Correctional Center in Winnebago, Wisconsin. Mr. Ninneman is turning 67 this month and has been diagnosed with cardiac disease, leaving him with only 25 to 30% of his heart function, which again puts him at risk for serious injury or death if he contracts COVID-19. Mr. Ninneman is expecting to participate in an earned release program and also has a tremendous amount of family support at home. This case, as Tim mentioned, involves the fundamental right of persons to be free of cruel and unusual punishment and to receive due process. It involves the right not to have a criminal sentence be turned into a death sentence as the virus spreads through correctional facilities. And so we brought this case to minimize as much as possible the risks of COVID-19 for everybody in correctional institutions, but especially for people like Mr. Ninneman and Mr. Sussick, and the thousands of others who have an increased risk of severe complications and death if they contract COVID-19. Releasing and removing people from correctional institutions is a public safety issue, and it's a racial justice issue as well, and the time to act is now. And so I want to move on to just talk a little bit about the urgency of this, and a little bit about contact with us and next steps. And so, of course, we completely understand the urgency of this matter, and that many of you watching may have loved ones who are currently incarcerated and may be wondering, what to do, what next steps should be, if you should contact us, what you should do. And while, of course, you're certainly welcome to do so, you don't need to for this case to potentially have an impact on your loved one. So we're not looking to add any other petitioners at this time, but as Tim mentioned, we are asking for systemic and widespread relief as part of this action. And again, just to reiterate some of those things that we're asking for, this case urges courts to appoint a special master to help the state remove people from correctional facilities, giving priority to those who are over the age of 60, and who also have health conditions or diseases that put them at an increased risk of COVID-19 complications, ordering the DOC and sheriffs in the state to adhere to CDC guidance, and ordering all circuit courts to consider the serious health risk posed by detention in bail hearings, supervision, parole revocation hearings, and sentencing. So this is a really, it's a widespread ask, and we think it's a multifaceted solution as well. So if the Wisconsin Supreme Court grants this relief, it would apply broadly. And so we just wanted you to know that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emma. Now I'd like to invite Dr. Lorraine Halinka-Malko and Dr. Amanda Simonek, who are associate professors of epidemiology at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee Zilber School of Public Health, to speak about the importance of decarceration from a public health perspective. Doctors?
Thank you, Sean. I'll talk first. My name is Amanda Simonek, and I'm an epidemiologist. And from a public health perspective, I just want to emphasize that the nature of this infection, that it's a respiratory infection that passes through droplet spread, If you cough or sneeze, or some studies are even finding breathe near somebody else, it can be transmitted to them. And because of that, social distancing is really the primary way that we can prevent infection. That's why we're under a safer at home order in the state of Wisconsin broadly right now. Other characteristics of this infection are that it can take an average of 5 days from the time you're exposed to when you actually become symptomatic, and up to 14 days. So you may walk around sort of infected with the pathogen and able to transmit it to others long before you realize that you're ill yourself. In about a quarter of individuals, it's estimated, they don't ever become symptomatic. And so you could be spreading the infection to others when you don't realize you're sick. And so this is why we have been told to stay in our homes, to only associate with people in our household, and if we have to go out to places like the grocery store, to keep a 6-foot distance, and why it's essential in order to contain this pathogen and prevent its spread to really be able to engage in social distancing. In addition to those kind of characteristics of this pathogen, people, or what we found is that people who have chronic conditions are at a high greater risk of complications. If you have conditions like diabetes, obesity, lung conditions, you have 4 to 7 times higher risk of needing to be hospitalized. And so from a public health perspective, we're not just concerned about the people that are in detention facilities right now, but also in terms of our broader healthcare capacity in the state of Wisconsin, and what it will mean if we allow individuals that have high-risk conditions in prison settings to become ill, and how that will impact the rest of our community, in addition to those individuals that will have to suffer the complications of that infection themselves. And we know that in African-American population is being disproportionately affected by coronavirus, and that's the same population that is disproportionately affected by these chronic conditions, and that is is disproportionately imprisoned in the state of Wisconsin. So that combination of those factors really makes it imperative that we intervene and allow for the social distancing that's being recommended at the population level to also take place in the prison setting, in order to protect the people that are detained there and protect our broader community. And I will pass it off to Dr. Malko, who will talk about some of the challenges in implementing social distancing in the prison setting that really make decarceration necessary to enable that to happen.
Thank you, Amanda. So I'm Lorraine Helinka-Malko. I'm faculty in the Zilber School of Public Health at UW-Milwaukee. And one of the things that's really important to understand, so as Amanda was saying, we are doing social distancing in the general public, right? And that's what's really helping to stem the spread of COVID-19. We absolutely cannot do social distancing in prisons and jails, okay? And especially not at the levels at which our prisons are populated right now, okay? We have overcrowding already. We have too many people for what the facilities were even designed for, and even if they were at capacity, it still would not allow for social distancing. Social distancing would mean a single person, right, through a large amount of space, right? It would mean not having people share the same bathrooms, okay? Not having people share the same facilities. So it is not possible in the current conditions in the prison to have social distancing. Furthermore, correctional staff and other staff are going in and out of the prison. Okay, so they could easily be exposed in the community and bring that into the prison. Now, the DOC says that they are screening, they're medically screening people. Well, it is not possible to fully medically screen for COVID-19. So as Amanda was saying, we're talking about a very large percentage of people who can transmit the infection and show absolutely no symptoms. Okay, so that's like 1 in 4 people who have the infection will never show symptoms. We have lots of people who eventually will show infection, but they will go through days where they weren't showing any symptoms, and yet they can still transmit it. So even if they were taking the temperature of all of the officers as they go in and out, asking them these things, that is not going to be sufficient to know whether or not they're infected. And what we know now about other what are called congregate living facilities, so what's happening in nursing homes now, in nursing homes and long-term care facilities throughout the country, that's what they're trying to do, right? They're trying to screen the doctors, nurses, aides, et cetera, who come in and out of those facilities. Well, it's not working. And those facilities, people are actually inside in separate rooms, right? So we don't have the crowding issues that we have in prisons, but it's not working. There have been 2,300 infections nationwide in nursing homes. We have 450 people in nursing homes who died, right? Even though these procedures are being implemented. Okay, so that's not gonna work. Furthermore, we have the issue of people who are incarcerated having, you know, the nutrition in prisons are very bad. So they're not being, they don't have good nutrition to support health, and they have lots of underlying health conditions, right? So about half of people really have these underlying health conditions, including obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure, all of the things that really increase both the likelihood of hospitalization and the likelihood of death. We also have a very limited medical care infrastructure in prisons, right? There's a lack of personal protective equipment. There's rationed access to soap, water, and clean laundry. Okay, a lack of access to alcohol-based sanitizers. All of the things that you want to supplement social distancing with. Okay, furthermore, incarcerated, no, sorry. It's really important to understand that incarcerated people have inalienable human rights. You probably already all know that, right? So they have a right to adequate health care. They have a right to life, okay? And so they have a right not to contract disease while they are under the so-called care of the state, okay? Particularly an infectious disease that is potentially lethal. As Amanda was saying, a primary reason for this safer at home order is that if we get these huge outbreaks, which are inevitable, they are inevitable to happen throughout the prisons in Wisconsin, if we do not rapidly reduce the number of people, then what we're going to have is we're going to very quickly overload the capacity for our 2,600 ICU beds in the state and the 620 ventilators, okay? And many of these prisons are in rural areas that have very limited numbers of ICU beds, okay? So this is going to affect not only incarcerated people, which is what we're caring about most right now, but is also going to affect the ability of other people who live in those areas to be able to access care when they need it. So I just want to emphasize that it really only takes one correctional officer, asymptomatic correctional officer, going in and out of a prison to potentially infect an entire facility. Okay, we already have in federal prisons 8 people who have died, with 283 people who've been infected. 8 people have already died. So without swift action to reduce our state's prison population that would allow effective social distancing, it is virtually inevitable that we're going to have severe outbreaks of COVID-19 that are going to occur throughout our state of Wisconsin prison system. This is going to culminate in a public health disaster, including many unnecessary deaths of people who are under the care of the WDOC. So just to conclude that safe and rapid reduction of the prison population is the most effective preventive measure that we can take as a state to reduce the spread of COVID-19 within jails and prisons. And that as public health professionals, We urge actions to safely and rapidly reduce Wisconsin's prison populations in order to minimize the risk of severe outbreaks and especially hospitalizations and deaths among incarcerated persons, as well as correctional staff. And really, we must act now because it really should have started happening yesterday. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. We have a lot of questions in our chat. So we're going to try to get through some of these questions. Folks, please understand that we may not be able to answer all of your questions, but we will try to get to most of them. And I'm a tag my colleague and community engagement director, Emilio De Torre, to ask some of these questions along with me. E?
Sure, thanks. Thanks, Sean. I appreciate it. We've got a lot of great questions people are asking in chat and messaging us. And we'll start with this first one from Alan. Alan asks, how does the testing of in-custody folks in the Wisconsin DOC look compared to the rate of testing in other states? And hoping somebody can speak to that.
I don't know how it compares to the testing in other states, but I can tell you that the level of testing is much less than in the general population. So there are 23,000 approximately prisoners, and they've only done how many tests, Amanda? Something like 100 and
About
something?
100.
Right.
About 100.
Right. That's way less than we're testing in the general population.
Thank you. It's a deplorable rate. His question I was just texted, isn't prison already like a quarantine? Isn't solitary confinement like quarantine? Somebody else speak to that.
Well, I could take that, or Tim could take that, but I think others could possibly contribute as well. It is not like quarantine, as our public health experts have already explained. People are going in and out of the prison system all the time, and most people in the prison system, thankfully, are not in solitary confinement. If they were, we would be torturing them, as the courts have determined. So I think the crucial thing to realize is it's not safe in there. Just like it turns out it's not so safe to be in a congregate setting at a nursing home. People come in and out of these facilities. And then the problem is that people are on top of one another, inevitably, when you have conditions as crowded as our state prison and jail systems are. And that means they're going to spread it to one another. Social distancing is at least theoretically possible for us in the real world. We even have some risk of exposure. The risk of exposure in prisons and jails is astronomically higher. That's why the rate of transmission is at least 7 times higher, or about 7 times higher, I think is what the calculation was at Rikers Island as in the general population. It is demonstrably not safer to be in a jail or prison than it is to be in the general population.
Thank you. So Cindy asks, how confident are you all that the Wisconsin Supreme Court will take this up, given the proclivity of the justices sitting currently?
I think I quasi-volunteered to take a question like that too. So some people would say that, I'm naive, but the Eighth Amendment is actually fairly clear that it violates the Eighth Amendment for prison officials to be deliberately indifferent to the risk of a serious medical harm. And there have been, Tim alluded to some cases involving tuberculosis. The courts have been clear that the jails and prisons are required to protect people from communicable diseases. And if there's no way to do that, except to get people out of harm's way by removing them from the dangerous place that they find themselves in, then the only way to resolve that is to get them out of harm's way. That means out of the prisons. So I you know, I think that our Supreme Court, like all courts, wants to, they want to follow the law. And I am hopeful that the fact that they have ordered the state to respond within 7 days is somewhat encouraging. And I also hope, frankly, that, you know, the litigation process is always uncertain. But I think it can clarify for people the seriousness of what happens. And I've been surprised by juries, by courts that I was afraid would not go the way that it seemed clear to me they should. And over again, I've been surprised in positive ways. That's not a promise by any means. I think this is an uphill battle. But I also think that we have to have hope that the courts will do what they need to do, or that the possibility of the courts intervening will give the backbone to state officials to do what they know needs to be done.
Thank you, Larry. I'd like to be anonymous. Asks, don't prisons already have hospitals to help sick people?
I'll start with that. Generally, there is only one, I believe, correctional facility in this state, in Dodge, that has medical care. Now, there are certainly small clinics or sick bays in almost all of the, and probably all of the prisons, but not hospital care, and not ICU care, and not ventilators. And so what the real risk, or one of the risks, one of the dangers, in addition to the danger to individual people who are incarcerated in our prisons, is that because they will need to be out to local hospitals. And most of our prisons are not in our metropolitan areas where our large number of hospital beds are. They're in rural communities where you have small community hospitals that can very quickly be overwhelmed if prisoners need care because they've been infected with this virus. And there are a number of counties where there's no hospital at all, or no intensive care available at all. So the amount of care inside is completely inadequate to deal with an outbreak of this pandemic.
And just to add briefly, healthcare in prisons are non-existent. And to Tim's point, you know, the hospitals do not have the capacity. They're not even, you know, in the area. We're talking about prisons that are in rural parts of Wisconsin, and hospitals are 10, 15 miles away. And we're talking about hospitals that may not even have the capacity to deal with an influx of individuals being sent there for treatment of this virus.
Yeah, just real quick, there's what the Dodge Correctional Center has, or correctional institution has, an infirmary that's a little higher level than the standard prison, you know, what is effectively an outpatient clinic type healthcare. And the other that has an infirmary is Techita. But frankly, those infirmary beds are mostly used by elderly people as essentially nursing home beds. Or people coming back from hospitals after having surgery. So they're not really true hospital beds by and large. They're really primarily sort of step down from the hospital temporarily, or you know, people who are elderly. So as Sean and Tim have said, treatment will not be provided in the prison, because it can't be for this condition, especially anybody who has anything like a serious case. It's going to have to go to a local hospital.
Also,
Thank you.
I want to point out that, so if people are trying to be treated by anything else, like, you know, normal health conditions that they might have, the prison medical facilities are so limited that they're not going to be able to treat COVID-19 patients and then keep other patients safe from COVID-19 at the same time, right? They're just not going to be able to separate people out within the medical facility because they're just small and they don't have the capacity for that.
Thank you all. Very complex answer for what's going on. A lot of the folks asking questions have a common thread of caring deeply for people that are currently inside. And I'm going to just synthesize Wendy's question, which is the shortest of them, which says, is there anything we can do other than just waiting to see what's going to happen? And how can we get our loved ones with comorbid conditions to be considered in this decarceration? So a two-part question. What can everybody watching this do? And also, how can we get the people we care about to be considered in this process of decarceration?
Well, I can just say, as a non-lawyer, I think everyone should call the governor and the DOC and the Department of Health Services and keep on calling them and tell them that they need to do what they can do, which is more than they're doing, to reduce the prison population in Wisconsin.
And I'll add to that as well, because this is the reason why we do these Smart Justice Town Halls every week, is to engage folks all over the state, to give you updates, to keep you informed, and also to keep you engaged. And we're continuing to ask folks to call the governor, to call your local sheriffs, your prosecutors, and ask them to do their part as well, because we sent out a letter to them and we asked them to begin to implement the CDC guidelines. And we know in the guidelines, it emphasized social distancing. And we know that you cannot do social distancing in a facility or a jail that is already overcrowded. So I encourage folks to continue to call the governor, continue to call their local sheriffs and the prosecutors in their regions, and hold them accountable. That's what we have to do. We have to hold these folks accountable and ask them to do what we put them in office to do, which is to be empathetic to what individuals are going through who have made a mistake and who have been sentenced into our carceral system to serve their time and not to serve a death sentence.
Does someone want to take the other part of the question though?
Which is how can we get our loved ones who are facing comorbid conditions or aggravated physical conditions or high risk as part of this decarceration process? And I don't know if that's really for one of the attorneys.
I think my answer to that is, first, there needs to be a process ordered or put in the Department of Corrections. I mean, right now, they haven't put in place a process, and that's the problem. And so that's what we want to get the state, the governor, Department of Corrections to start doing it voluntarily. Hopefully they don't wait until the Supreme Court orders them to do what is right. But if not, then hopefully there will be a process set up, if we are successful in this, in which we would hope that people with comorbidities and risks will be lifted up as people needing to be removed from the prison system to avoid the risk.
So one of the pieces of relief that we're asking for is the appointment of what's called a special master, and it's legalese. But basically, what we would hope is that the court would appoint a person who has both expertise in public health and in the prison setting. And it may not need to be a single person. It could be a team of people, and I would expect that would be part of it. And so they'd be identifying people who are at particular risk as people to release. And then I would also expect that that special master would be doing things to try to then sort of recalibrate the, in addition to prioritizing release, recalibrate the distribution of people in the system who are, as they're going through this. Because it's not going to be instantaneous. Even if the court does order something, there is going to have to be a process to ensure that people aren't, just dumped on the street. They need to be sent into a safe setting and in a way that doesn't create more harm to them than being in the system does.
Thank you. And there are many more questions, but we'll try to limit it to just one or two now, given the timing. There are a lot of questions about the rhyme or reasoning behind how the DOC is applying COVID tests. Some facilities seem to have multiple incarcerated people who have tested positive for COVID, but no staff. Some facilities have 5 staff that have tested positive for COVID-19, but only 1 inmate has been tested for COVID. Are we aware of what or how the DOC is even applying the tests?
No. With respect to staff are not tested by DOC. According to DOC, staff self-report if they have been diagnosed. I believe the different facilities have different screening for people who are guards or other people working inside the facility. I'm not sure that it is uniform, but it's not clear to me. And you can see a map on the DOC website of where they have tested, where people have tested positive, how many tests have been completed, how many they're still waiting for. I hope that they have the people with the right qualifications advising them on the testing, but right now, what we know is there are 23,000 people in these correctional facilities, and they've only tested 100, and they don't even have all the results of those 100 tests yet.
I just want to add that the Wisconsin Department of Health Services has added that essential staff in what they call high consequence congregate settings, which includes prisons and jails, with any kind of COVID-19 symptoms, that those individuals, as well as residents in jails, prisons, or other like assisted living facilities, other congregate settings with any kind of symptoms, are a priority for being tested by the state labs, which is the Milwaukee Health Department lab and the Wisconsin State Lab. So the 2 labs in the state that are doing testing have prioritized basically any incarcerated people or the staff who have symptoms as being people who should be tested.
Thank you. There are many other questions, and sadly, we don't have time, so I'm going to flip it back over to my friend Sean. But I do want to say, because I know, panelists, you can't see the Facebook screen, there's an incredible amount of gratitude coming to you from folks that are here, people watching this acutely because their dads, their moms, their partners are currently incarcerated. And the message is very clear. All of these folks that are incarcerated are incredibly scared right now, and they don't know what's going on. And there's a lot of gratitude to all of you in the ACLU for lifting this up. So thank you, and over to Sean.
Thank you, Emilio. So just to run back real quickly through what was discussed here. So the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Unions of Wisconsin, has filed a lawsuit in the Wisconsin Supreme Court seeking the release of elderly and vulnerable people from state prisons in order to avoid a dangerous outbreak that would further strain the state's health care capacity and put the public health at risk. Wisconsin prisons are severely over capacity, making social distancing measures needed to stop the spread impossible. Department of Corrections holds almost 23,000 adults in facilities with a design capacity of 17,000, thus exceeding their design capacity by more than 30%. To date, the state of Wisconsin has reduced the state prisons population by just 1.3%, leaving almost 23,000 people incarcerated in overcrowded conditions where social distancing and other mitigation measures recommended by the public health experts are impossible. These are the reasons why we brought our lawsuit, and we will continue to keep you all informed as we move forward. And we ask that you continue to call the governor, continue to reach out to your local sheriffs and prosecutors and hold them accountable as well. This is at the end of the day, this is a human issue, and we're asking our elected officials, local and state, to move with a sense of urgency as it relates to these men and women who are held within our jails and prisons statewide. Thank you, and continue to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and we will continue to give you updates as we move forward in this progress. Thank you to all of our panelists, and you guys have a great rest of your night.